Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for Economics. It's my great pleasure today to have a special bonus event. Normally at this time in July, we're starting to wind down. We'd never go on vacation, but the public programs start to cut back. But we had a windfall from down under. The Honorable Bill Shorten, member for Maribyrnong. How do I say that? Okay, that'll do. From Victoria in Australia, who is, of course, the leader of the opposition in the Australian Parliament, and the Embassy of Australia kindly offered to have him give a statement here today, and we are, of course, delighted to provide a forum. Carolyn Millar, who's the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy, will be stepping up in a moment to provide a more proper and no doubt more fulsome introduction of Mr. Shorten. But just to say, we have been delighted through the years to work with the Embassy of Australia and various organs of the Australian government, with Heather Scott and others of the excellent economic experts there. And it's a very exciting time to have Australia in the lead at the G20 and setting an agenda for global growth. Growth is good. The question is, at what point do you have the guts to say, put that ahead of some other temporary concerns, and the vision to say, here are ways of doing it. We're not quite there yet, but I do commend and appreciate what the Australian government, which I realize the leader of the opposition by definition is not a member of, but in a nonpartisan sense, I commend the leadership role that the Australian government is taking in the growth agenda in the G20, and my understanding is that Mr. Shorten will also be addressing some of those issues from his views today. So, in that spirit, let me turn it over to Ms. Millar from the Embassy of Australia to do a more, as I said, fulsome introduction of Mr. Shorten. Ms. Millar.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Posen, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I think it's quite fair to say in this company that successive Australian governments have pursued the kinds of approaches that you describe, and we're delighted in that context to have with us the Honourable Bill Shorten MP to speak on global growth, trade, equity and opportunity. Mr. Shorten is the leader of the Australian Labor Party and the leader of the opposition in the Australian Parliament. As a member of the former Labor governments from 2007 to 2013, Mr. Shorten served in a number of ministerial roles, including Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, Minister for Education, Minister for Financial Services and Assistant Treasurer. Before entering federal parliament, Mr. Shorten was very active in the union movement, including as National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union from 2001 to 2007. Today, Mr. Shorten will discuss the upcoming G20 summit in Australia and the economic development opportunities and challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. It's my great, great pleasure to introduce Mr. Shorten.
Hello and good morning, or indeed in Australia, good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. In February of 1942, after the fall of Singapore, Australia stood isolated and alone. In those dark days, the great Labor Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, spoke to our nation of what he called the task ahead. Curtin said, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I can make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs of the traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." So amidst the most destructive struggle between freedom and tyranny, Australia looked to America. 72 years on, the task ahead for our generation is very different, but we still indeed look to America. We look to America as a partner in prosperity, a driver of global growth, and a leader in free trade. We look to Asia too. As another former Australian Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating, memorably said, "Australia looks for its security in Asia, not from Asia." Back in 1942, the Australian city of Brisbane was the headquarters for General Douglas MacArthur. In November of this year, it will host the G20. In Brisbane, President Obama and President Xi, Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Cameron and Prime Minister Modi will sit around the same table. Leaders who represent 2/3 of the world's population, 85% of the world's gross product, 80% of world trade. This G20 forum has grown in significance and stature since the global financial crisis, due partly to the work of former Prime Ministers Rudd and Gillard. And now, in the second decade of the 21st century, we stand on the cusp of one of the most profound economic and demographic transformations in world history. After all, a beautiful, precious little baby born today will most likely live in 2 centuries, the 21st century and indeed the 22nd century. When money has never flowed faster, when our world has never been more borderless, when our possibilities have never been more limitless, the leaders and the nations of the G20 have new opportunity. Having acted to help the world economy withstand the worst financial crisis in 3 generations, our task is now to build the architecture for the next 3 generations of prosperity, for our world economy of 2030 and 2050 and beyond. The G20 has the opportunity to set meaningful reform objectives and achieve them. The G20 has the opportunity to ensure that complacency is not used as an excuse to delay or put off essential reform, that protectionist retreat does not prevail over economic advance, that short-term vested interests do not obstruct global benefits. Today I submit to you 5 key areas of action for the G20. 1, inclusive economic growth. 2, youth unemployment. 3, rebooting global free trade. 4, dealing with multinational tax avoidance. 5, climate change and energy security. These are not easy matters, but I believe that we should indeed be setting ambitious goals. Before I discuss these priorities, I would like to make this brief comment on the current international context. The recent United Nations Security Resolution is a most welcome step. Effective international cooperation will be essential for investigating the tragedy of Flight MH17. Right now, our first task must be to assist the families suffering unspeakable grief and to identify and bring home the victims' remains. So far, President Putin has indicated that Russia will fully cooperate with this resolution, with this investigation. But the words must be matched by actions. Getting to the truth of the matter may, and I stress only may require Australia and other members of the G20 to consider whether Mr. Putin should attend the Leaders' Summit in Brisbane later this year. In any event, it is still 4 months before the G20 commences, and I believe that the way Russia conducts itself between now and then will be very relevant to the decision that we make. Now, I said that there were 5 goals that the G20 should be considering in the future. Firstly, it's inclusive economic growth. The 2% global growth target set by the G20 finance ministers is a worthy starting point. But without real and concrete action, it is merely an empty gesture. More than ever, we need to examine not just the conditions that create growth, but the methods that we employ to include all of our citizens in its benefits. In formulating a global growth strategy, our focus needs to be on inclusive economic growth, growth that eliminates poverty and enhances equality. These two objectives are interrelated, but they are not identical. Consider China. In the 3 decades between 1980 and 2010, 680 million Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty, more than the current population, the entire current population of Latin America. China alone accounts for 3/4 of the world's total decline in extreme poverty over the past 30 years. This is a most remarkable economic achievement without parallel in human history. But it is not solely due to economic growth. The degree of pre-existing income equality within a country is a major factor too. One economic survey found that a 1% increase in incomes in the world's most unequal societies delivers a 0.6% reduction in the poverty rate. A 1% increase in incomes in the world's most unequal societies delivers a 0.6% reduction in the poverty rate. In the world's most equal countries, the same 1% increase cuts the poverty rate by 4.3%. In the world's most equal countries, the same 1% increase cuts the poverty rate by 4.3%, a much greater number. To borrow a favourite economic metaphor, a nation's income distribution, its equality, in other words, will determine how many boats are lifted by the rising tide. As Piketty wrote in his in-depth analysis of income distribution, Capital in the 21st Century, for much of human history, the rate of return on capital significantly exceeded growth in the economy. An economic trend that meant that the only way to become wealthy was to inherit wealth. In the late 19th century, the United States of America broke this nexus. In the relative blink of history's eye, the United States became famed as the self-made nation, the home of the small businessman with big ideas, the entrepreneur with boundless optimism, and the inventor of devices that the world didn't know it needed, then decided it couldn't live without. And as the developing nations of the Asia-Pacific emerge from poverty, in so many ways it is the United States that they will be emulating. It has been this way for generations, ever since talking films gave aspiration an American accent. For many, these are modest ambitions, a life where your hard work is rewarded and your children enjoy a better standard of living and greater opportunity than you did, just as you did better than your parents. Yet in China and America and the world over, inequality looms as a threat to growth. Paradoxically, the same factors that have driven economic growth in developed nations and lifted millions out of poverty in the developing world, globalisation, technological process, and market-oriented reform, have magnified inequality. Not just inequality of income, but inequality of access. Access to affordable health care, access to quality education, to technology and to civic amenities, and to clean air and to clean water. This is a challenge for advanced and emerging economies alike, to give people more equal access to the drivers of economic growth. A strong minimum wage. And delivering real wages growth is so important to achieving access, particularly for those on the lowest incomes. My home, Australia, has a proud tradition of supporting a reasonable minimum wage that is a genuine living wage, not a life sentence of working poverty and insecurity. Not only does a strong minimum wage reward people for hard work, often in physically demanding jobs, it also, as President Obama has put it, helps grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up so that prosperity is broad-based. An increase in the value of real wages creates more consumers in bigger markets, and it most certainly drives economic growth. A second matter of importance for the G20 I would submit is youth unemployment. Investing in the capabilities of individuals improves our aggregate performance. This is why the economies of the G20 need to re-engage with unemployed young people and empower them to fulfil their potential. Right now in the United States, youth unemployment is double the unemployment rate. In Australia, it is more than double. In the United Kingdom, it's nearly 3 times as much as the national rate. Every year that a young person, full of unique talents and capacities, spends out of the workforce is not just a year of personal loss, but a year of lost economic output and a marker on a road to a future of missed opportunity. Our future competitiveness, our future productivity depends upon the skills and flexibility and experience of our workforce. This means removing barriers to higher education, investing in training and retraining. It requires us to see learning and education as a public good, a public investment in our future, not just a short-term expense or a private benefit. Without sincere, genuine action, we risk shutting out the next generation of employees from the workforce and letting their talent and potential go unfulfilled. And we shall not achieve the lasting growth without action on youth unemployment. A third most important priority for the G20 is rebooting free trade. The World Trade Organization estimates the progress on free trade would deliver trillions of dollars in income gains. And the high road to trade liberalisation are multilateral trade deals in which all countries agree to lower trade barriers. In 2014, we live in a world of global supply chains where trade and services and IT agreements are essential to economic growth. A world where the majority of trade is conducted in semi-finished components, not finished goods, nor resource-based starting materials. In such a world, our world, modern open market trade arrangements and infrastructure are vital in enabling the free flow of the best ideas, eliminating poverty, tackling youth unemployment, and even preventing war. Our challenge today is not to argue the case for the theory of the reform, but it is to deliver them. The last global trade deal of any significance, the Uruguay round, was concluded 20 years ago. As it stands, global free trade negotiations have ground to a halt, frozen in the Doha round. It is overdue for the economies of the G20, nations who represent 80% of the world's trade, to consider a reboot. We need to reignite the trail to multilateralism. The G20 cannot and must not blithely accept the low road of a limited realpolitik view where bilateral and free trade market access agreements between nations become the only options on the table. I recognise that free trade agreements, market access agreements between nations in some areas and sectors have value. They can, in fact, be stepping stones to multilateral arrangements. My own party in Australia, Labor, progressed Australian agreements with Korea, China and Japan when in government. We also finalised arrangements with Malaysia, Chile and a comprehensive arrangement with the ASEAN economies and New Zealand. But as instruments of compromise and the product of pragmatism, bilateral free trade agreements will always offer unproven market access inferior to global free trade rounds. Rebooting multilateralism demands a two-pronged attack on overt and covert protectionism. The 2008 Washington Summit widely viewed as the meeting that made the G20 the world's premier forum for economic cooperation, agreed to a standstill on protectionism. This was an important statement of principle, especially in the context of the global financial crisis. After all, a most understandable national reflex at the time of global financial instability, rising unemployment, and plummeting investment is to revert to populist short-term protectionism. But this standstill, saying that here and no further back will we go, has sometimes been honoured more in the breach than in the observance since then. Between May and November of 2013, the WTO reports the G20 member nations introduced 116 different trade restrictive measures in that 6-month period. Only 20% of the protectionist measures introduced amidst the GFC have been wound back. A level of progress on par with the world's next big 10 biggest economies. This is hardly leadership by example by the G20. Redoubling efforts on overt protectionism need to be accompanied by a new focus on covert behind-the-border protectionism. Andrew Mackenzie, the head of global mining house BHP Billiton and the chair of the B20 Trade Task Force, has labelled this murky protectionism as the true enemy of free trade. The 2009 Trade Ministers meeting in Bali identified measures such as currency manipulation, unduly burdensome registration procedures. This process, initiated by former Australian Trade Minister Craig Emerson, was designed to inject new momentum into the Doha round. The G20 should champion the Bali principles and move for their rapid implementation. Right now, the G20, speaking with a single voice, is probably the only institution that can reboot global free trade. And it must. For the party I lead in Australia, the Australian Labor Party, our commitment to open markets has never been an ideological one or a theological one. It sprang from the realisation that Fortress Australia, sheltered behind its high tariff wall, was not delivering for our people, the Australian people. The high tariff wall kept prices elevated and isolated firms from global competition. Australian businesses that might have thrived on the global stage were kept cosseted. Labor's 3 waves of tariff cuts in 1973, 1988 and 1991 delivered over 2 decades of continuous economic expansion. We look at open markets as the most important engine of growth that the world has known. And we know that growth is the best way of creating good and fulfilling jobs in productive and competitive enterprises. We recognise that whilst trade liberalisation boosts growth overall in the medium and long term, it can also deliver, though, short-term pain for industries formerly protected by tariffs. Labor believes that governments have an obligation to not leave behind the workers from those industries during periods of economic transition, to make sure that the people have the skills and flexibility to adapt to change and benefit from it. A 4th priority is multinational tax minimisation measures and dealing with them. In our modern, knowledge-intensive economy, companies are minimising costs through innovation, outsourcing and automation. And successful businesses are always looking for a competitive edge. So many of the biggest multinational corporations are also leading the way in tax minimisation. Whether it is elaborate transfer of patents and transactions through the memorably titled Double Irish with a Dutch sandwich, or the use of intra-company lending to effectively shift profits from high-taxing jurisdictions to low-taxing ones. Shrewd companies are pushing the boundaries in pursuit of tax arbitrage for maximum benefit at minimum liability. But these practices do substantially erode a nation's company tax base, and they distort the market, unfairly disadvantaging local businesses, big and small. It is most remarkable in a nation like Australia that Google or Glencore pay less corporate tax than the high street pharmacy or news agency. The existence of this practice creates a perverse incentive for nations to compete for initial international investment by hollowing out their own tax systems. The 2013 G20 summit in St Petersburg endorsed the OECD's action plan on base erosion and profit shifting. Brisbane should maintain the international momentum on this matter. The viability and credibility of the G20 depends on implementing what was agreed at previous meetings, not setting and forgetting new goals each year. In the near term, a concerted push to reduce base erosion and profit shifting is an obvious and immediate method for bolstering the financial position of advanced economies. In Australia, Labor alone acted to improve the budget bottom line by over $5 billion in this area. In the longer term, it is evidence of the fact that governments cannot ensure fiscal sustainability purely through austerity-style cuts or Keynesian stimulus. Sound economic policy always depends upon careful consideration of both expenditure and revenue. Getting the maximum efficiency out of our corporate tax base is especially important when we consider the demographic realities of this century. When I was at school, there were 7.5 taxpayers to support every Australian aged over 65. When my daughter was born in 2009, the ratio was 5 taxpayers to 1 Australian aged 65 or over. By the time she turns 40, it will be 2.5 taxpayers to 1 person 65 or over. Now, this is not a unique quirk of Australian demography. It'll be one of the dominant themes of the world's advanced economies over coming decades. At the same time, as the personal tax base is contracting, our citizens will be requiring more and better services from government. Breakthroughs in medical research will create higher expectations in healthcare. The growing number of high-skilled jobs will increase the pressure on the availability and quality of higher education and vocational training. And senior citizens, people who've worked hard all their lives, paying taxes, raising families, making a contribution to their communities, rightly believe that they are entitled to dignity, security and comfort in older years. Incremental reforms that remove loopholes and tighten tax arrangements are important. But former Australian Treasury Secretary Dr Ken Henry is among those who've argued that we need to take a more ambitious approach by looking at rent-based taxation arrangements. In the United Kingdom, the Mirrlees Review has considered the idea of a unitary tax model, treating a multinational corporation with numerous legal subsidiaries as a single entity. Other experts propose the option of destination-based cash flow taxation, leaving the income from the real transaction, less all expenditure on associated transactions, to reduce profit shifting. Of course, all of these options and ideas are highly complex arrangements, rife with difficult implementation issues. And practicalities are especially important when we consider the revenue collection difficulties, governance issues and other shadow financing concerns in developing nations. Simply put, any progress on a more comprehensive, effective approach to tackling multinational tax evasion depends upon international cooperation. The G20 will have to drive more progress to a more efficient corporate tax system for the future. The fifth and final priority for this year's G20 must be climate change and energy security. Make no mistake, climate change is an economic issue, an environmental issue, and it is a security issue. And for all these reasons, it belongs on the G20 agenda for the economy, for the environment, and for security. Just as global growth and global free trade and multinational tax avoidance requires international consensus, climate change is a global problem that demands a global response. For my party in Australia, this has been a most politically difficult issue for some years now. Having been unable to secure support for the first incarnation of an emissions trading scheme, Labor introduced an economy-wide price on pollution, the first step in moving Australia to an emissions trading scheme. Australia's emissions trading scheme was designed to link to the world's largest carbon market, the European Union, and internationalise our carbon mitigation. The price on carbon, however, was recently repealed by the current Australian government, which ran a long, highly effective negative campaign against a carbon tax. So this month, Australia gained regrettable, in my opinion, worldwide attention for moving backwards on climate change. Labor remains committed to effective action on climate change through policies like an emissions trading scheme, because it imposes the minimum cost on Australian businesses and Australian households, but because also opting for inaction on climate change is both environmentally and economically reckless. A view supported, amongst others, by former US Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, who has warned of, and I quote, "the profound economic risks of doing nothing on climate change." According to Paulson, waiting for more information before acting is not conservative. It is taking a very radical risk. It is also, I would submit, another form of false economic protectionism, a damaging economic isolationism which defers issues and solves nothing. Today, 39 national and 23 subnational jurisdictions accounting for almost a quarter of the world's heat-trapping global gas emissions have implemented or are on track to implement carbon pricing instruments. In 2014, the world's emissions trading schemes are already valued at more than $30 billion. The 7 pilot schemes in China are the second largest carbon market in the world. The Republic of Korea will introduce its ETS on the 1st of January 2015. Mexico put a price on carbon in 2013. New York and 8 other North Atlantic states, Northeast region states, are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Oregon and Washington are exploring carbon pricing options, and California itself, the world's 8th largest economy, already has an ETS in place. President Obama has made his preference for an ETS clear, but the political dynamic in Congress has meant that the United States will focus its national effort on reducing emissions through heavy regulation and intervention. As the world moves to take action, it will not be long before a lack of climate policy is an obstacle to finalising trade deals. In fact, it is entirely possible that trade negotiations will mandate an effective price on carbon to ensure a level trading field. Just as the 2015 Paris Climate Summit will give world leaders a chance to formulate their emissions targets, the G20 offers an opportunity for stronger, deeper economic links through an emissions market. The benefits of emissions trading is an economy-wide incentives that it creates for clean energy and more efficient energy use. Effective action on climate change provides a strong price signal to diversify the national and global energy mix. As we all know, a disruption in national energy supply can have catastrophic impact on a nation's economic development. Reliable renewable energy acts as a shock absorber for unforeseen natural disasters and sudden geopolitical shifts which can imperil conventional energy supplies. For G20, energy security depends on creating an environment of regulatory certainty and encouraging innovation and investment in renewable technologies. So in conclusion, delivering prosperity with fairness, rebooting global free trade, tackling youth unemployment, closing tax loopholes for profit shifting for multinationals, and making progress on climate change action and energy security are ambitious goals, that I know. The diversity of views between G20 nations and within G20 nations only underlines the difficulty of the task ahead. But rehashing reasons why we would fail will not help us face the challenges and opportunities of this century. Now is not the time for incrementalism, patching or pandering. We need to break the mould of short-termism and sectional interest. We need our political discourse to be about planning for the long term and investing in the long term. Our peoples are sophisticated decision makers. In their own lives, they plan for their future well over the horizon. They are capable of expecting the same from our political discourse. In fact, they expect no less from their leaders. If we are up to the task of reform, to build prosperity that lasts beyond our lifetimes, well, then we must be bold, we must be ambitious, and we must be optimistic. I began today with the words of John Curtin, a great Labor Australian leader and a leader in wartime. I conclude with the words of another political leader who I deeply admire, President Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "Far better is it to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much, because they live in a grey twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." This must be our goal today, to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, to build a better, more prosperous world. Thank you very much.
Hello? Perfect. Well, thank you, Mr. Shorten, for a visionary and ambitious agenda in the spirit, as we said, and you said, of the long-standing internationalism in a pragmatic way of the Australian governments of both parties. Let me, since we at Pearson Institute tried to do a lot of the intellectual heavy lifting on implementing and creating these ideas, let me ask you a couple questions on some of the specifics in your talk before we open it up to the audience. In your discussion of trade, I found it rather striking. Maybe I missed it, but you seem to pointedly not use the term TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership, not mention APEC, and if anything, some people might read your remarks as something of a slap against the TPP efforts, that you're at least cold on them. Could you expand a little more specifically on where you see that going? And secondly, in that context, so that you and your Australian friends and press are well aware, in the trade circles in Washington, the Japanese-Australian deal is seen as something of, betrayal would be too strong, but a huge setback, because Australia agreed to not pressing the Japanese very hard on agriculture, and thereby created an excuse for the Japanese in the TPP negotiations to keep saying, well, look, Australia didn't demand this, why are you bothering us? So again, I was wondering if you approve of that approach, if you think that was a reasonable thing to do, or if there's some room to reconcile these things.
Your second point is, of course, a most interesting one, and I'll just briefly deal with the TPP. In a speech, you can't cover every sub-multilateral arrangement. APEC was an idea which Labor pushed very strongly in Australia, so we think it's good. One of the question marks we have over the TPP, and we're neither hot nor cold. Don't economists say that that's an average temperature? You have one leg hot, one leg cold, therefore you must be average. The dispute mechanism is a big issue in Australia. Having our legal arrangements being able to be arbitrated somewhere else is, it's not unknown, but that's a big step forward for us, and I think that's a big issue in our discussions with the United States. But you know, the principle is an excellent principle. The second issue, though, is very timely. The Australian government hosted the Prime Minister of Japan in Australia very recently. And you know, one of the heralded triumphs of this was an announcement of the Australia-Japan Free Trade Agreement. I'm not convinced it's a free trade agreement in the definitional sense of free trade. It's a market access agreement which increased market access in various sectors. I was disappointed in agriculture. I certainly can see the argument that because Australia has gone first, has it set the bar for outcomes and given Japan wriggle room to argue with other nations, well, if Australia was happy with this, then that sets the benchmark. I used to be a union negotiator, and quite often the first deal that you get up in a round of bargaining in a sector would set the pace. So it's not just trade negotiations where the first move defines what happens subsequently. So I think that is difficult, although there were some improvements in the agreement. As an Australian, I'm pleased whenever we can score a deal. You know, that's always good. But as I said in my speech, incrementalism by centimetres or inches is far less desirable than big giant steps forward. That's why I think that we mustn't allow in our political discourse the tyranny of low outcomes. I believe our challenge is to breathe life into multilateral negotiations. I think our other challenge is to draw a line in the sand about reversing into more protectionist measures. I will say this about American agriculture. I'm not sure Australia's always got the best deal out of American agriculture either.
No. We would love to see all the sugar lobbyists get shot. Don't worry about that.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. I love the sugar industry in Australia.
Well, you're
There's a couple of marginal seats up the Queensland coast. We're very pro-sugar in Australia.
you know, in this house we're very happy.
Did that answer your question?
No, that was great to have such a forthright and negotiating smart response, and just in this house we're very happy to call out.
I always worry with deadlines in negotiations. If the other party know that you've got a deadline, you're already behind the 8 ball, aren't you? I mean, if the other party in negotiations say that you've got a visit or you've got something happening and you need to have an announcement by then, you put a little pressure on yourself, don't you? So, you know, there's plenty of issues.
No, absolutely. Let me turn to another issue which you raised and which you obviously feel very strongly about, which is the issue of inequality. And we're doing a lot of work on that here. It's obviously the hot topic, as well as being a meaningful topic. But again, let me ask you about two things you said. The first was you mentioned how in Australia, and we know this, for many, many years, there's been a high living wage for, be it waitresses or miners or whatever, in a way that a lot of other countries do not have. That's a domestic policy. What is the international piece of the inequality issue that you think should be discussed at the G20, or is it driving home to the US or to others that Australia has been able to successfully take some steps vis-a-vis inequality, and you guys got to learn from that? The second thing is, I just wonder if you could reflect a bit. We talk a lot now in this context about the enormous rise in inequality, but of course globally, inequality's been shrinking. We've seen a billion people in China, a couple 100 million people, not as many as we would like, but in India, a couple 100 million people in Europe, Eastern Europe, all rise up enormously over the last 20 years in terms of income. And so from a global perspective, inequality is shrinking. And I was wondering how that affects the G20 views on this. Do you see that?
Well, there's plenty in that. Might I go to the middle part of what you said first, which is about inequality in the United States and the role of a minimum wage. I don't presume to give a lecture about how other jurisdictions should run themselves. But in the Australian experience, and I've had the opportunity to see workplace relations in the United States too, I think that once you have a job, you should be able to get out of poverty. The challenge, I think, in parts of other jurisdictions, not being Australia, possibly being the United States, is you've got people who work hard who never get out of poverty. To me, that's an anathema. A strong minimum wage. And a minimum wage isn't the average wage in the country, nor is it what happens above the minimum, but it's the safety net. In my experience in Australia, a strong minimum wage has meant that people can put down mortgages, they can pay for their kids' education. But in combined with a strong minimum, about 10% of Australia is on the minimum wage. So there's 11.5 million people in some form or another working for either some hours or full time. Arguably about 1.3 million of those are on the minimum wage. Don't hold me to those exact. So it is genuinely a safety net. Some people argue that in sectors, it's not mining. Mining pays well above the minimum wage in Australia.
Nowadays, yes.
But in retail, agriculture and hospitality, That's where the minimum wage is most prevalent, cleaning. They are low-paid industries, so without a minimum wage, either it would be lower, and we would be confronted with a situation where people are working and still in a state of poverty. But we look at our strong minimum wage in the context of 2 or 3 other measures. We have good national health care. I know that's a matter of great controversy and debate in the United States. But remember, the beauty of having a strongly funded universal healthcare system is that the employers don't have to pay the bill. So that's part of the safety net. We also have compulsory superannuation, which is a proportion of an employee's wage paid into a defined contribution account. So it's not one of those unfunded propositions, which I know are a part of the American landscape. So and that's at 9.5% of your wage. So what happens is we've got a system where people are being, some of their wages are being used to save for old age. We've got healthcare which doesn't fall on the burden on the employer, and we've got a strong minimum wage. Combine that with a decent pension, and what you have is you have the chance for people to keep, it's not comfortable living on those, and we have a tax transfer system where there are payments to families as well. Those levers provide, I think, the basis of some equality. Now, there's a lot of debate in Australia over becoming more unequal. The top 7, or the wealthiest most 7 Australians have as much as the bottom 20% in Australia, and that's a source, I think, of some upset. So the challenge is, when we talk about inequality, what are the measures that you use to deal with it and the levers? But in addition, I think on the left side of Australian politics, our challenge is that when we talk about inequality, it can't just be a debate about redistribution of income. It has to be, how do we let people earn more income? So that's part of our challenge. That a debate about fairness is one which says that we want people to get ahead, and you also do that through education, which goes to the first part of your first question, which you said, what international propositions are there?
Right.
You know, I'm Labor, which means that we believe in education, education, education. Let people be empowered to control their own futures, and you do that through education. That's preschool, that's primary, secondary, and it's good access to technical or university education. And there's a giant piece to be done on adult education. So there are propositions. I think on the minimum wage debate, it's been argued by some employers that if you have a strong minimum wage, you'll lead to unemployment. Let me put it to you, and it'd be an interesting study to see across the United States, where you've got national employers with franchises in different jurisdictions. The reality is, and I know this is the case in Australia, that in different states of Australia, national employers employ people on slightly different wage rates because there's been historic different wage differentials, even at the minimum level. These companies have never been able to produce any data which says that they're less likely or more likely to employ where wages are cheaper or more expensive. Now, I get that you need flexibility on weekends. There's always a challenge around penalty rates, but fundamentally, I do not believe the case has been proven in Australia with a strong minimum wage that it leads to greater unemployment, because if it did, where the wages are slightly higher, theoretically the unemployment should be greater, and it's just not, and I wonder if that's the case in the United States.
There is a lot of state-level studies, and it's a very live issue here. You're right to raise it. I'm aware the time is going, and I want to open it up to our audience and anybody who would care to ask a question. For those of you unfamiliar, there's a standing mic there. I'd ask you to go to the mic and identify yourself. Otherwise, I can continue to go down the list of Mr. Shorten's proposals. Please.
Michael Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. We're very pleased to broadcast in your country with a great audience. I think it can be argued that the one country in Asia from which Australia seeks security is Indonesia. You've had a presidential election in which the losers are refusing to accept the result. And regardless of what happens on that issue, they've had a more nationalistic campaign there than they've had since the opening up of democracy. So where do you see Indonesia going in the coming months with a new president coming in October?
Do you want me to respond after
yes,
each question? Or the new president of Indonesia. I mean, it's remarkable. Indonesia's a remarkable democracy, and hats off to some of the previous rulers of Indonesia in the last 10 and 15 years. They really have taken Indonesia on a path of change. I'm optimistic about Indonesia. It's arguably the world's largest Islamic democracy. Their growth numbers are remarkable. It's a sprawling archipelago of 170 islands with many different cultures. They've got lots of challenges, but the progress they've made has been remarkable. It is without a doubt. I love the sort of international diplomatic language where everyone says we've got no better friend, you know, no better friend than Poland, no better friend than Australia. I get it. But with Indonesia, I say this, there is no more important relationship for us. We think that the new president, it's very early days, will be good to deal with. Really, when you think about the sort of diversity of Indonesia, the fact that the new president won by 6% or roughly 8 million votes shows that, you know, over 125 million people voted. It was done in a peaceful fashion. I think the unsuccessful candidates now said he didn't really want the job, which is a legitimate response, I suppose, if you come second. Australia's up for working with the new fellow, and we've had good relations by and large for a very long time. We think we're pretty optimistic about Indonesia.
Great. Please.
I'm Jo Marie Griesgraber with New Rules for Global Finance, and thanks for your speech. You've got my vote. I wanted to get into the weeds a little bit on the trade agreements and ask what your position and or Australia's position is on trade and financial services, which we've seen some dissonance between where the U.S. is on regulating banks and what might happen within the trade and financial services liberalization. There seems to be a tension between those two things. And also on intellectual property rights, especially in the area of pharmaceuticals, where copyrights are strengthened, which one could say is anti-free trade, especially for essential medicines. But that's my prejudice. Thank you.
They're very important issues. There's two prisms for me when I think about the answer to that question. One is Australian-American relationships, then one is principles generally. With Australian-American relationships, we're both pretty developed economies. So we're not going to see eye to eye on everything. I mean, part of our challenge is how do we retain, and let's use pharmaceuticals as a key issue, how do we keep the smart end of the pharmaceuticals industry in Australia if we don't have some protections for inventions and patents? You know, the lead time, the development time is roughly 15 years. I'm sure there's someone in the audience who'll give me a more accurate number, but use that as a rule of thumb from the idea to the commercialisation and the return. So I think the area of copyright is not a simple issue. As a general principle, we want medicines to be available to the developing world. The question then is, though, how do you ensure there's a return so that the developed world, or Australia, keeps its edge? See, if we don't want to go down the path of low wages and being a commodity economy in terms of people, then we need to go up the path of being a smart, skilled and innovative nation, which is where Australia needs to go. So our challenge is, how do we deal with helping the rest of the world rise, but still keep a piece of the action for us as we emerge, as the rest of the world or developing economies emerge. So that's the challenge. I think it's case by case. We've got a good system of, it can always be better, but of support for our pharmaceuticals industry, and I don't mean necessarily the production, but the provision of cheap medicines to Australians. So we do get that there's a role in terms of allowing patents not to be monopolised for such a period of time that it bumps up the cost of medicine. So it is case by case, but I think that's one where Australia and America can work well together. Generally with financial services, I think you can either try and do everything and want to have a comprehensive agreement on everything. I think tackling services as a heading, rather than trying to sort out agriculture, manufacturing and everything else, services and areas are legitimate, big enough area to push for multilateral outcomes, so you could do that. But what I also think within that is that for us, our interest is in China in terms of services and making sure that the WTO and that the accounting standards and that there is protections at law for Australian investors in China, and not just China, but developing economies. That's very important. So a lot of this is, by its nature, case by case. But I do think that financial services is an area where we can make more progress on the global trade agenda than just relying on nation-to-nation bilateral market access agreements. So that's a bit of a general approach. So it's not one size fits all.
Very cool. Please.
My name is Peter Doyle and I'm speaking on my own behalf. First, if I may, a note of personal thanks because my twin sister is an Australian citizen and her life was saved by a practice instituted by the government of which you are a member, namely of routine screening for bowel cancer at age 50 for women. So thank you very much for that. But turning to your remarks today, I think that I, and perhaps many in this room, would be quite sympathetic with the principles and with the aspirations of the 5 items that you laid out. I wonder if you might consider that there needs to be a 6th. And the one I might suggest would be global early warning systems. Because one of the characteristics of the recent global crises, namely the financial crisis and the euro area crisis, was the failure of the prior global early warning systems in respect of those 2 crises. And therefore I wonder if a task for the G20 would be in that light to consider its own internal workings and structure and membership, the way in which the IMF, the Financial Stability Board, the major central banks and Ministry of Finance feed into it, in order that the world doesn't, what you might say, unnecessarily get caught or blindsided by such shocks in future.
I have to just interject while you formulate your response to Peter, that there is, of course, both a question on the global early warning systems, do we have any that work, even if there was the will to implement them? And then secondly, do we have the will the will come in the particular case? There was talk, you mentioned the very brave and useful commitment by the G20 to try to stand up, at least in principle, against additional protectionism. But mutual surveillance hasn't gotten very far in the macroeconomic world. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts, if you're sympathetic to Peter's views, any thoughts on how to advance that?
It's a big topic, Peter, and longer than the time available wouldn't do justice to the issues that you're raising. I'd make this observation. I think that some of the financial liquidity arrangements through the Basel process, the Swiss city called Basel, but I accept that other people call it Basel or whatever. I think that is looking at some of the stability of banks. I do think there is better discussion between the central banking regulators than there ever has been before. That's where I probably see the most fertile growth or opportunity. The regulators working out what are the appropriate standards, and then there being a degree of media vigilance on this matter too. I could think of a 7th area which I didn't go to today, which is the equal treatment of women in our societies. So if you unlock if women get treated equally, you will invariably have economic growth. You'll have equality. You'll get, I think, a whole lot of things. So I think the Basel process is useful. I think central banks working together and corporate regulators working together, they're very important forums. But I'd have to take your question on notice. But I will put a plug in for something I didn't say, but I do think it's relevant to everything we do, that societies who have equal treatment of women are more equal societies. In Australia in 1986, average household wealth was about $450,000, give or take a few thousand. In the mid-2000s, average household wealth in Australia is nearly $800,000. There's been 2 drivers of it. One is compulsory savings, that superannuation piece. But it's just been women entering the workforce. So, if someone wants to ask you in one sentence the secret of Australia's success in the last 30 years, it's giving women more chance, more equality, and we've still got a long way to go. Anyway, I'm a politician, that was completely not the question you asked. Before someone can discern that,
If I wasn't so sympathetic, I wouldn't have let you get away with it. We're coming up on time, so I'll ask our remaining questioners to be a little more concise in their questions, please.
Sure. Jessa Bonner, Public Citizen. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to your party's position on labor in the TPP, and more specifically if you support enforceable provisions in the TPP.
I think discussion about workplace safety and labour provisions is appropriate. You've got to look at the case of each agreement. For some of these optimistically and ambitiously named free trade agreements, it's just whether or not we can sell some dairy into somewhere, or another country can sell us auto. So I'm not, if you like, as a Labor person, as a person who worked in unions before coming into Parliament, I'm very vigilant about this question. But for some of them, the left can sometimes lather up unnecessarily. It's a straight market access arrangement for certain sectors. But there needs to be some transparency in arrangements between first world countries. As much as we may fulminate about it, it's not the same issue. But if you're doing comprehensive agreements with developing economies, I think there needs to be some discussion. I'm agnostic about the mechanism, but I'm committed to the view that we need to be able to have transparency in arrangements. That tragedy in Bangladesh, I think you'd rather just turn the clock back and wish it had never happened. But what I do get that since then, and at the G20 remarkably in St Petersburg, there was discussion about workplace safety. But I think even more remarkably is that 150 multinationals have signed up to codes of conduct. So for me, it's not a particular mechanism, but for me, a good job is a job where you get a reasonable income, you have a certain number of hours, you have some control over your tasks at work, and it is a safe job, and that you have proper health care. You know, these are, so for me, labour standards don't necessarily have to come in a particular clause, but they come in an analysis of everything you do.
Great.
Brad Carr from the Institute of International Finance. Got a question on superannuation, and in the context of the Murray inquiry last week, I thought there were two themes. One was confirmation and endorsement of the Great Bold policy initiative of putting the sector in place, albeit needs some minor tweaks, and the other was the administration costs within the system are high by comparative standards. Do you see there as being I guess, learnings for other countries of the Great Bold policy move that Australia took in putting that in place? Or was that a bit of a one-off of circumstances at the time that aren't so replicable? And conversely, does Australia need to learn more from abroad as far as how to improve the efficiency of the system?
The last thing people need, as I said earlier, is Australians lecturing everyone else. When we are utopia, then we'll, send out a tweet to everyone else. But I am proud of our superannuation system. Unions back in 1985, we had centralised wage fixation then. Unions took the remarkable step of not having a 3% pay rise and putting it into compulsory savings. The deal is it's concessionally taxed as it goes in, and it receives certain beneficial tax treatment during the accrual stage. But as an anti-inflationary capital pool raising method, it was just, I think, stunning. It's a good idea. You get people to, and there's an argument in Australia, it's just a new tax on employers. It's not. It's foregone wage rises. So real wages increases, which have happened in Australia since the convict era where you didn't have to worry about wages, and basically absorbed the increase in superannuation. So it's gone to 3%. It didn't just happen. So to go to the first part of the question, was it a one-off? No. In 1992, legislation was passed to make it go up to 9% in increments. And I was the relevant minister a year and a half ago, and we moved it from 9 to 12%. The new Conservative government, in an act of fiscal stupidity, which is breathtaking, have frozen it at 9.5%. And the reason why I say it's breathtakingly stupid is that people are growing old, so you're not going to stop that. And therefore, either you encourage people to save for their own retirement, or you have transfer systems and the taxes pay for it. So, like it's there. The question is, what do you do with the money in between? And the beauty of the superannuation system is we now have a savings pool in Australia north of $1.5 trillion, which is bigger than our GDP each year. Could you imagine if the United States, under President Reagan, in 1985 had moved to 3% of wages going into superannuation? And then could you imagine if that had happened again under Prime Minister Bush in 90, or maybe it was by that stage, Clinton, 92, 93, going from 3 to 9% over the next 6 years. And then again under President Obama, going from 9 to 12. You know, at the time of the GFC, you'd have had $10, $12 trillion in savings here, which you don't currently have. I just think it makes a difference. It's deepened the liquidity of our capital markets. So it's not a one-off. We'll keep fighting with the Conservatives about increasing it to 12%, but it's now at 9.5%, and it's not the only plank of our secure incomes in retirement. We have encouraged private savings, and we also have a strong pension safety net, but I think it's a distinct source of national advantage, a defined contribution scheme.
It's interesting because I think most economists would say you're onto something, but the benefit would be much more over the longer term, having to do with sustainability of fiscal policy and pensions. And the global financial crisis might have helped, might have actually blown up the bubbles more, because you would have had more money chasing assets that are not returning that much.
That's a fair point, but when we do our asset allocation, some of it's in shares, domestic, some's in international, some's in listed trusts, some's in venture capital,
right.
Some is in cash. You know, we have strategic asset allocation, not legislated, but you know, you don't put all your money in the equities market or housing market. There was a question on the cost of the system. We've been lowering the cost of the system, and I don't think this financial report in Australia released last week's sufficiently taken account of changes that we brought in last year before we lost the election, which will see downward pressure on fees and charges.
Can I ask the last two questions? We'll take them together and then let the Honourable Mr. Shorten answer, please.
Sure. Will Martin at World Bank. The commodity orientation of Australia's exports raises a lot of challenges. Exchange rate pressure on manufacturing and the rest of the traded sector during the booms, and big risk of loss of output when commodity prices fall. And I'm just wondering what you'd like to see, what you'd envisage doing about those challenges.
Great. And our last question, please.
I have two brief questions. Dee Porter from the ABC. I want to know how confident you are that President Putin will be at G20. Secondly, what is your reaction to the authorised biography of Joe Hockey that's being released in Australia today?
What is your reaction to, sorry, for those of us who don't speak Australian, what was that?
Our Treasurer has released a book, and the journalist's asking my reaction to it.
I'm sure you haven't read it and won't, so that's good.
I've read a summary. Just on the commodity basis of the Australian economy, the minerals, Australia is undergoing a readjustment away from the mining boom. A number of good and bad things happening. There's been a whole lot of capital expansion and investment, which has been great. It has seen lower productivity rates as a result. What we're seeing now is moving into the production phase more and more. That's actually leading to an improvement in our productivity as you see the benefits of the investment. Prices have eased, and let's face it, they were going to, because sooner or later the rest of the world's going to start digging up some of their dirt and ore and rock and getting into good money and sending it to China and India and Japan. But volumes are up. So another good point is that it's still a very important part of the Australian economy. What we're seeing though is an adjustment away from mining to the non-mining sector. Part of the challenge though is that our currency hasn't eased up as much as we thought. You know, when you're going well in minerals, currency's up. That was okay according to orthodoxy, because as prices ease, currency comes down and other sectors start to benefit more. Our currency is remarkably sticky. So we're seeing a readjustment away from mining in terms of job numbers, construction job numbers in mining. But the volumes are such that it's still a big driver of our future. Our challenge is to make sure that we have skilled workforces, that we have productive infrastructure, to make sure that we're emphasising innovation. One of the challenges of the high dollar is a lot of our innovation comes out of manufacturing and related research. If our manufacturing's hollowed out, who takes up the slack in science and innovation? Many of you know the formula better than me. It's innovation, it's infrastructure, it's people, and it's skilled, resourceful people with good education and a strong safety net. So we are seeing, though, a change in our economy, and that's having a bit of an impact in terms of the job market at the moment, and also the need to encourage non-mining sectors to take up some of the slack. Our monetary policy is in reasonable shape, though. We've still got a bit of room to move there. Part of the challenge, though, is our federal government with this latest budget has been one which has been controversial, and some would argue that it's stalled confidence. So there's plenty going on, but I think some of the changes in mining are inevitable. Going to the questions about the G20 and the autobiography, listen, I've read a summary of the autobiography. I will engage further in it. I've nothing to really add to it at this stage. Some of the comments, though, about the Treasurer wishing that his budget could have gone harder are frankly startling, because this budget's already at the extreme end of unfair. But to be fair to the Treasurer, I should look at the whole book before I comment further. But comments that this budget didn't go hard enough are out of touch. It's already gone too hard. In terms of President Putin of the Russian Federation and the G20, the Labor opposition has been in lockstep with the government about the MH17 tragedy. It is unbelievable that separatist terrorists using advanced technology could just snatch 300 souls out of the sky 6 miles above. The families are grieving. Labor supports the national objectives of retrieving the bodies and having a thorough investigation. We sincerely hope that the Russian Federation's actions match their support for the UN Security Resolution. As I said in my speech, there are 4 months to go to the G20. I think the Russian Federation's attitude, whether or not its actions match its words, will be the test, and they have time to demonstrate their bona fides. But this is a most dreadful set of international circumstances, and Australians are deeply, deeply, deeply affected and grieving for the loss of 28 citizens and another 9 residents who live in Australia. I just hope and pray that the Russian Federation cooperate fully and utterly so we can get to the bottom of the matter, and then we can have justice for these people who did nothing wrong.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to have had both a vision statement and a tour through some specifics of Australian politics. But most of all, thank you, Mr. Shorten, for engaging in how to make the more ambitious goals of the G20 you set out into practice, which is obviously where we all have to work. This meeting's adjourned.